Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carmen Blair, the Deputy Director of the San Mateo County Historical Association, and I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's Courthouse Docket. Sponsored by Cypress Law and Heritage Foundation, the Courthouse Docket is a monthly series of lectures and performances that is normally held in Courtroom A of the History Museum. When I spoke at the Courthouse Docket in July, we were hoping that the History Museum would be able to reopen on July 21st. However, on July 13th, the governor closed all indoor museums in California. At this point, museums are only able to open according to the assessed risk levels in their county, and the risk level in San Mateo is considered too high for indoor museums to open. So we are continuing with our online programming. I hope some of you have had a chance to look at the online Victorian Days walking tours that were filmed throughout the county and our Victorian Days reenactment and fashion show. With our Courthouse Docket webinars, we are looking to explore different aspects of local history. Now, before COVID, one of the history milestones we wanted to address in 2020 was the centennial of the ratification of the 19th Amendment enfranchising women nationwide. Today, we are pleased to have with us Tatiana Irwin. She is an associate professor of history at the College of San Mateo and a graduate of San Jose State University. A Bay Area native, her first research interest was her own family's history in California, going back to 1849. Professor Irwin has been a museum educator, textbook author, and is currently a historian of California and the Pacific world. She will be sharing with us today Organized Womanhood, Defining the California Voter in the Fight for National Women's Suffrage, 1911 to 1920. Professor Irwin has agreed to take questions at the end of today's program. We do ask that you please type your questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat. With that, we welcome Professor Irwin.
Hi. Good afternoon. So yes, this was an event that was going to happen several months ago and then a couple months ago, and we had all sorts of important anniversaries whiz by us in the meantime, but I get to join you now from my home. I think that's where a lot of us are right now. And, you know, my home has, I think, as with a lot of you, become also my classroom. So this is probably a very intimate way to talk about women's history and to talk about these milestones, but it is nice to continue in the swing of these conversations about history. One thing I will reassure you of is that even though we passed the August 18th celebration of the passage of the 19th Amendment, because as a lot of you I think are already familiar with, we passed women's suffrage in the state of California in 1911, we're coming up on the October 10th anniversary of that. So maybe we're actually ahead of schedule instead of behind schedule in celebrating some of these really important milestones. Glad you could join us. Glad you could join me. I'm going to be talking about women's suffrage in California under the idea of organized womanhood. So with this lecture, I hope what I'll be able to do is talk to you a little bit about how women in California saw themselves, what their role was, both in passing suffrage in California and nationwide, and talk frankly with you about some of the ways in which they chose to define citizenship and voting that put some of these groups at odds with one another. And I think is important in the larger triumphal arc of women's history to talk about some of these partnerships, some of these allyships, some of these problems that arose in the course of looking for suffrage for women. I am going to give you a quick warning that some of the slides might have offensive or triggering language and images. I've actually, because this isn't the same educational opportunity as I would have with students, I have edited some of that out because it can be hard to contextualize it appropriately and responsibly. But I do, again, want to be very transparent and honest that some of the material can be unflattering, can be jarring. And so while we will talk about and celebrate all of the important women that helped us towards suffrage, there will be some material that I just want to give you a heads up can be a little disconcerting as well. And to give you a heads up that I will probably mostly be focusing on Northern California. This is such a long and rich and important history. We could go into quite a litany of details about it. I'm going to focus mostly on Northern California as we talk about this. And just to give you a heads up about where we're sort of going, I'm going to try to arrive at answers to or conversations about a certain set of questions. And the first one, of course, is how did women in California arrive at suffrage before the Federal Amendment? Because we know that they did about 9 years before. So then what did California women do between 1911 and 1920? What did they do for the larger movement towards suffrage? Who fought for inclusive suffrage? Because it can be a bit of a red herring when you're studying women's history at this point in time and you hear the word equality and equal. Usually women are using equal as defined by women equal to men, not necessarily people equal to one another in terms of physical ability, national origin, cognitive ability, language, race. And so there are a group of women who are going to fight more intersectionally for suffrage, and I want to recognize and honor them and maybe put some of their names out there if they're not better known to us already. And very importantly, I think for us speaking in San Mateo County, what did women on the peninsula do for or perhaps against women's suffrage? Some of you also might be familiar with this bit of trivia that the peninsula and San Francisco County were actually particularly hostile towards women's suffrage. And we did have a few clubs on the peninsula who seem to have been working, if not outright for suffrage, adjacent to suffrage. But it can be hard to draw some hard, fast conclusions about their direct participation with the movement, especially in the context that many of them would have been surrounded by women who were at best apathetic towards the movement. So what was going on here? And hopefully by the end of this, I'll be able to answer some questions that then arise for you. As Carmen's really generous introduction suggested, this is a point of interest for me. I am a California historian by training, and I do focus on issues of women's history, particularly turn of the century, club women's work. A lot of my work that I did in graduate school was around the Country Women's Club of Campbell. And in looking at the Redwood City Women's Club, saw many of the same movements, some of the same fundraisers that I saw in studying these women in Campbell who were raising money essentially to build a library almost at the same time. And seeing how well connected the women in the Redwood City Club were across California and outside of California to other women's clubs, I wouldn't be surprised at all if I were to dig a little deeper that there might be some hard, fast friendships amongst the groups. They seem to have been well connected. I also have some suffragists in my own family's background. So I am a 6th generation Californian, and I have had the great pleasure and luck to go through some family history with my grandparents over the summer. And in those conversations and going through these photos and these family records, I was able to uncover some contributions that my own grandmothers and great-grandmothers and great-great-grandmothers make to women's suffrage in the course of the same period we're going to be looking at today. On the left is my great-grandmother, Bertha Carney Irwin. This is her in Palo Alto with my grandfather, who is to her left as a little boy. And she actually served in the Idaho State Legislature from 1921 to 1922. While this talk is not about women's suffrage in Idaho, I think that talking about women's suffrage in California is a conversation about women's suffrage in the American West, as they did work cooperatively together. And Idaho, of course, is the 3rd state to gain suffrage in the United States in 1896. And so my great-great-grandmother was a part of that, and then served with those benefits from having been enfranchised. And on the right is my great-grandmother, Leona Loftus. So this is my grandfather's mother. And while she was not directly connected to any voters' organizations, she was a native daughter of the Golden West and was a member of the Society of California Pioneers. And that both of these groups, particularly the native daughters of the Golden West, in the early 1900s, were a part of policymaking. They were really important lobbyists behind certain legislation regarding immigration. So I go back to this history in my own family with both the pride and understanding that I have some strong women, but that I go with eyes wide open, understanding that what it meant to be a strong woman, especially a strong middle-class white woman at the turn of the century, doesn't always look like the things that we today feel comfortable with. And certainly for my great-grandmother, that did include exclusionary immigration policy. So just to give you, I think, maybe a sense of how I come at this history with great excitement, wanting to acknowledge where there are a lot of firsts, but also not feeling shy to hold accountable attitudes in the past that shape policies today, and some of the uncomfortable things that we have to unpack, even in our contemporary world. So taking a look at our actual trajectory towards suffrage. Before the gold rush, I think we have to understand that while women didn't have what we could explicitly call suffrage, they did have agency, right? And agency is when you get to enact your ideas, designs, choices on the world. And particularly before the Spanish arrived in California, it seems pretty clear that many indigenous Californians were a part of the decision-making within their tribes. So again, we can't explicitly call this suffrage, but we do understand this to have been a participation in their various governance systems. So for example, some Pomo, Chumash, and Miwok tribes had women co-chiefs. And this image here on the left is actually of a woman who is a shaman as a part of the Hupa tribe. I think a lot of us enjoy this idea that history is somehow cyclical, or that history repeats itself. That's one I hear my students talk about a lot. They really enjoy this quote. And I don't think that's a perfect analogy for all history, but I think it's important for us to think about the way in which maybe history isn't a story of linear progress, always getting better, that there are some ways in which certain attitudes cycle in and out and can be very different depending on culture or group. I'm not going to pretend like Spanish and Mexican California was a perfect utopia for women. It was overwhelmingly paternalistic, but there is one detail I think that's really important to consider about the way women operated in Mexican California, and is they were able to own land. Because Spanish law came from Roman law, where women were able to own property within marriage. This is something that Mexican women were able to practice that their counterparts on the East Coast in the United States, for example, could not. In fact, it's one of those pleasant coincidences of history that in 1848, of course, California becomes a part of the United States. And this is the same year in New York State that Elizabeth Cady Stanton successfully passes, what she alone does not pass, but she's behind the Married Women's Property Act of 1848. So you do see California coming into the United States, not yet as a state, but as a part of the United States, right around the same time that nationwide, the United States is beginning to adopt these women's property acts. The reason why I bring up property is because so much of what's important to people's agency and autonomy is being financially independent, being economically autonomous, and that even today, I think we can recognize that having the right to vote doesn't automatically equate perfect representation within a democracy. That, and this is something Thomas Jefferson famously championed to great effectiveness, right? The idea that you should be able to support yourself and act autonomously. That's the best way to ensure a democracy truly reflects the values of the people who are casting their ballots. So these are important to consider as we go into this. Now, California does become a state in 1850. And so that helps us to think about, okay, in the American period, how is it that women began advocating in California for suffrage, especially before a federal suffrage amendment and before many states, even in the West, had adopted suffrage amendments within their own states. Okay. So I'm going to take a look at the 1860s, a couple of important dates that we're going to be centering in the next few slides are going to be 1896 and then, of course, 1911. So there's a lot of work that's done between the 1860s and 1896 when women first successfully put a measure on the ballot to consider women's suffrage. They successfully get it on the ballot. They don't successfully pass it. But. And the woman featured here on the right is Laura DeForest Gordon, and she's going to be attributed as the first woman in California to give a speech on women's suffrage. And she does so in 1868. And Gordon is quite a busy woman. She is also behind the Women Lawyers Bill in 1878, which is instrumental, of course, in allowing women to attend law school and then practice law in the state of California. She also organizes the California State Women's Suffrage Society. And she's one of these women who in 1870 is challenging the idea of suffrage for white men only by saying this is something we need to make truly universal, okay? And she calls for what she says is, quote, a true democracy where white and black, red and yellow of both sexes can exercise their civil rights. So Laura DeForest Gordon is someone we can certainly point to in California history and the history of suffrage as being an intersectional feminist, right? This is someone who thinks very inclusively about the right to vote and does not define suffrage for herself at the exclusion of others. But that's not where the country's going, and that's not where women's suffrage is going. So on the left is a pretty ugly cartoon that is explicitly about California's suffrage and challenging this idea in the 15th Amendment that all men should be able to vote. And of course, that's all men who are citizens. There are certain people who are not allowed to naturalize and become citizens. Although with the 14th Amendment, you have birthright citizenship. So you do have non-white people who are born in the United States who are citizens, which is, of course, different than prior to the 14th Amendment. But the 14th Amendment, along with the 15th Amendment, has this tremendous backlash. And this cartoon here is basically saying they're trying to say how absurd would it be, right, if not only black men in California could vote, but also Chinese men and indigenous men. And they're saying this is something that they're trying to say would be absurd. Okay. White women who feel excluded by the 15th Amendment, including famous individuals like Susan B. Anthony, identify an important allyship in white Southern Democrats particularly, who are very hesitant about what happens to the white vote when it's, quote unquote, diluted by non-white voters, and that enfranchising white women might be an opportunity to stabilize the white vote in the United States. And clearly this is something that was embraced as an attitude in California as well. Gordon clearly does not agree. She does not align. Gordon and some of her cohort, like Clara Shortred Forts on the right and Naomi Anderson on the left, I would argue are a part of a suffrage group of the mid-19th century who was allied in abolition, allied alongside other black women, both black and white women together, that would subside as we get closer to the late 19th, early 20th century. But these are the women in the 1860s going into 1896 that will be really important to this first bid in California towards suffrage. Okay. Forts, like Gordon, is going to be a beneficiary of allowing women to practice before the California State Bar. And she's actually sworn in as the first woman admitted to practice law in California. And she is a part of drafting the various legal codes, amendments, propositions, measures that are suggested for the state legislature to enfranchise women. And her suggestion is to essentially sub the language in California for, quote, any white male citizen with, quote, any citizen or person. And then, of course, that would include both Black and white women. And Naomi Anderson, who worked alongside Forts and Gordon and actually traveled the United States lecturing and delivering poetry that represented the inequality or talked about the inequality of the franchise in the United States, and particularly California, was important in working alongside these women and reminding them what universal suffrage really would mean. Anderson, like a lot of her contemporaries, she was also part of the Women's Christian Temperance Union and various clubs. Although increasingly the clubs that were arising out of late 19th century, the women's clubs, even the ones who were proposing equality of suffrage, were segregated. And they were not segregated initially by the design of Black women to create their own organizations. They were segregated by the design of white women to exclude Black women. And then, of course, Black women discovered that in many cases they were largely on their own, even in California, which had a robust Black population. So unfortunately, this is suffrage delayed. They had been making great gains towards suffrage in 1896. In fact, the SF call endorsed women's suffrage, although it is telling that the San Francisco Examiner remained largely silent. The Democratic Party in California, in the state of California, rejected incorporating women's suffrage as a part of their platform. But there is this bright spot with the Republican Party and their state convention in Sacramento in 1896, where they are the first major party in California to adopt women's suffrage as a part of their platform. So things are looking good in 1896. And I guess if there's any boogeyman of 1896, it's the liquor lobby. The liquor lobby is really concerned that if women get the right to vote, that they're going to bring prohibition about once and for all. And so they campaign quite effectively, especially in cities. Ironically, of course, those very cities that we identify as being liberal and progressive today are actually quite conservative at that point in time regarding women's suffrage. The proposal to the state constitution is that, quote, no person shall, on account of sex, be disqualified from entering upon or pursuing any lawful business, vocation, or profession. And they go further to propose, of course, that women should be allowed to vote. Now, a lot of the drafting of these articles, these propositions that are put forth towards California voters, which are all men at that time, at some point, even when they are rejected, are later adopted by 1911, largely. And the language is quite similar to what they had drafted in 1896 and 1878. So I don't think it's a surprise. We've already foreshadowed it. Voters reject the amendment in 1896 by an 11-point margin, okay? I'm sorry, an 11 percentage point margin. It's quite significant. It's quite a significant defeat. But the tactics that they learn in pulling together this bid for women's suffrage is not going to be lost, right? The efforts that they put in are actually going to be part of their mobilizing techniques for 1911. Fundamentally, what they lack in 1896 is finances, is money. And that's just something they can't overcome, the liquor lobby, with that. Now, this is an image of an influential group of women in California fighting for suffrage in 1896. And you can see at the center is the famous Susan B. Anthony. To her right is an even more important for the period we're going into, women in suffrage, and that is Anna Howard Shaw. And although Shaw is going to be an important figure across the nationwide fight for suffrage, Shaw has very specific ideas about the role of women, and particularly white women, white American-born middle-class women, in the fight for suffrage. The historian Gail Gillette has said about Shaw's approach, quote, "She used her analysis of westward movement as proof. Men conquered the West, but it became civilized only when white women developed homes and thus morality. America would face continued unrest until the country granted women full citizenship, the vote. A conservative reform would preserve the republic and the home." Shaw increasingly was using race to assure voters that suffragists were white and Protestant, and would develop, key to this, the right kind of, quote, civilization. Okay. This, you have to remember, is a time where nobody felt embarrassed, ashamed, or uncomfortable using the language of white supremacy. We don't have to do much revising and going back to this history to see very clear associations that these women are making between the morality of women as abiders of civilization. In this cartoon, tellingly, the woman has, the torch lighting the West, the way in which the West is more enlightened and will bring about this more enlightened view of suffrage and women's ability to vote and be, political actors. This imagery is all steeped in the idea of a very specific voter. Okay. Now, in 1910, things do change in California that make it more favorable to women's suffrage. The progressive wing of the Republican Party triumphs with the election of Hiram Johnson as governor to the state, as the state of California. Okay. And although Johnson himself seems to have been either personally opposed to women's suffrage or apathetic in a way that didn't really identify the importance of this for women and democracy, many progressive men in the Republican Party did understand that women were integral as allies to their good government movement, and were much more open to putting another opportunity on the ballot for women's suffrage than prior administrations. So this is a huge campaign, and although this is a campaign that's largely dominated by the major club women, it is one that smaller ethnic enclaves pick up as an important place to convince their community of men, of course, because men are the voters still, right? That they need to vote on behalf of women's suffrage. So we have women like Maria Lopez in Los Angeles, who campaigns within the Latino community, and she has flyers that are in both English and Spanish. In San Francisco, you have enclaves of Italian women who, remember, at the turn of the century, were treated with a degree of exclusion by American-born Protestant middle-class citizens. So they're campaigning with their husbands, hoping to be enfranchised. And Black women across the Bay Area create their own suffrage leagues and campaign in their own communities for the right to vote. In the case of Black women in particular, they're campaigning for women's suffrage at the height of Jim Crow and the height of lynchings. So this is a campaign for them that includes campaigns for federal policies that will hopefully end lynching, which we still, by the way, have not passed in the United States. So it's interesting to see how much work is still to be done. It's great to look back to these women and the campaigns that they waged as inspiration maybe for some of the work that we still have to do. So good news here, suffrage does pass in 1911, but only by 4,000 votes. And I love this as someone who encourages my own students to go out and vote and as a huge proponent of suffrage. I love this idea, every vote counts, of course, but people often think that this is just a saying, but it really does. And in this case, if you average out those 4,000 votes across California's various precincts, this actually goes down to a 1 vote margin per precinct, right? And in the federal amendment, it came down to one single man who had a very profound conversation with his mother the night before he went into the Tennessee state legislature and, cast his vote for suffrage, ratifying it. So suffrage is truly one of these cases you can tell people where it came down to one single person, okay? California then became the 6th state allowing women to vote. Not too shabby. Now, this gets at another question, though, that I proposed at the beginning. What did California then do between 1911 and 1920? And undoubtedly, women were a part of the national campaign. In fact, some of the founders of the Redwood City Women's Club, while not part directly of suffrage campaigns that I found in my research, perhaps they were, but I did not uncover that. They were absolutely a part of larger campaigns for peacetime movements in the context of World War I. They worked alongside Jane Addams and Hull House. So there was great correspondence there. We know that they spread their wings, they took flight, and they absolutely helped their sisters in other states that did not yet have suffrage. But they also worked very hard to define what suffrage would look like in California, and that when the day came for a federal amendment, which women would be allowed to vote. So I have a couple things to talk about here. I want to draw your attention to the flyer on the left, which does not actually have anything directly to do with the woman on the right, Catherine Phillips Edson, but is part of a larger theme that we should recognize throughout women's suffrage in California. And that was, if you look at one of the final pitches on this flyer, our Chinese servants can vote, but educated women cannot vote, is xenophobia as a tactic going all the way back to 1884 that resurges as a tactic in defining who California voters would be, which people would be allowed to vote, and which people would be inclined and have full participation in range of citizenship. This is where Catherine Phillips Edson does come in, because she was a very influential suffragist. She was one of the founders of the Friday Morning Club in Los Angeles. She was appointed by Hiram Johnson to various state committees and agencies, mostly in the campaign to reform the dairy industry in California and make sure that it was safe as a part of the Pure Food and Drug Act. However, she also joined Hiram Johnson in trying to adhere to a stricter gentleman's agreement. And the gentleman's agreement is what notoriously restricted Japanese immigration to California. And she did this by stoking the fear of the picture bride, or the woman who would come from Japan to marry men who were already living in California, Japanese men and Japanese American men living in California. California women often targeted Chinese, Filipino, and Japanese women because of the 14th Amendment, because with their arrival, the children born in California of these Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino parents would be entitled to full citizenship, which would include voting. And there was great panic at the turn of the century that the white population would be diminished by this non-white immigrant population. And so Edson is really at the forefront as a woman in California and a suffragist, conflating the two or believing it's part of her duty to monitor this. And, it really was prolific. This is an image of a booth at the Pan Pacific International Exposition from 1915 of the Race Betterment Society. The Race Betterment movement was a proponent of eugenics And they didn't see that as anathema to their work in the progressive movement. The progressive movement was about reform. And reform is what always got me excited in college and high school to talk about the progressive movement. It felt like this really great, optimistic moment in history. And as I dug deeper as a historian, I started to understand the full range of what reform could mean, depending on who's operating it. This is also a moment where you see the resurgence of the Klan, and that's not just in the American South. In fact, Klaverns popped up in San Francisco, Oakland, Sacramento, Fresno, and the San Joaquin Valley. And many of these women who were a part of these Klaverns and the women's auxiliaries of the Klan were ardent suffragists. They believed that it was a really important part of their civic duty and citizenship to vote, and to vote with a particular agenda in mind. Just to get an understanding of how popular this was, the Oakland Center for the Klan started in 1921. Again, this is the emergence of women's suffrage nationwide, and had 2,000 members in 3 years. Many of these men, but we know from images that I chose not to include today, this included their auxiliary of women who marched through the streets of Oakland. There are plenty of photos of their parades, and they are in full Klan regalia. So it was very clear to the non-white community in California of women that in some ways these former allies they had in DeForest Gordon and Fultz, and at one point women outside the movement, outside of California, like Susan B. Anthony, had really left them behind. And so who fought for inclusive suffrage? Certainly California's Black community of women and Chinese community of women. In particular, the Fannie Jackson Coppin Club in Oakland, who originated in 1899, partly for the purposes to promote social and educational events, but these events often included the proposal of anti-lynching legislation, challenging California's segregationist policies, and enfranchising the community of Black female club women in California. They are one of many groups to promote the passage of Prop 4, which is the suffrage amendment in the state of California in 1911. And on the right, one of the most important members, Lydia Flood Jackson, whose family came to California during the gold rush and ended up in Oakland as early as 1855, so truly one of the founding families of Oakland. Jackson and her family helped to integrate the California school system in the East Bay. In 1872, Jackson, featured here on the right, is one of the first Black students to attend school in Oakland as a part of an integrated community of learners. So these are activists to the core. These are people who fought to make sure that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were going to mean something in their applications for their families and their communities. Jackson is also an entrepreneur and a real estate investor. So she was quite powerful and autonomous in her own right. Again, when we're thinking about how important it is to have, autonomy, economic stability in your agency, Jackson's a very good example of this, okay? And of course, she's a club woman, right? Part of the California Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. A couple of women I want to talk about from the Chinese American community, both of these women of Chinese ancestry, but born in the United States, Chinese American women. Clara Elizabeth Chan Lee on the left, who was the first Chinese American woman to register to vote in 1911. And this is actually a picture of her registering to vote at the Alameda County Courthouse. And she is an internationalist when it comes to women's suffrage. And she also campaigned outside of California to get women the suffrage, get women enfranchised in China as well. And Tai Long Schultz, who is the first Chinese American woman to vote in the United States in California in 1912. And she actually worked with Donaldina Cameron, who famously set up the Presbyterian home for women who had been forced into prostitution and sex work in Chinatown. Schultz also worked at Angel Island until she was dismissed because she married a white man, and she and her husband were both fired from their government jobs because they entered into an illegal interracial marriage. On a lighter note, Schultz, I found out, was also a great enthusiast for pinball machines and was known to be, in the 1930s, a pinball wizard across Chinatown. I thought that was a nice moment of levity in some of these histories. We talk so much about the great things they do, some of the not so great things some people do. We forget that they're people, full-dimensional, whole people, and they have these great personalities too. I guess she was also a Studebaker enthusiast too. So there are several pictures of her in her Studebaker, and I guess she could be seen across San Francisco driving around. So these are some of the women who also fought for suffrage, right? So when we remember Stanton, when we remember Anthony, I think we should also remember women like Lydia Flood Jackson. We should also remember women like Clara Elizabeth Chan Lee. Okay. Now, I know that we are coming closer to the end of our talk, so I'm sorry if I don't give proper justice to our local groups, but certainly the Redwood City Women's Club is an important organization contemporary with this fight for suffrage, especially in the more expansive view of women's citizenship, organized womanhood, defining what citizenship would look like, breathing life into what women would be fighting for across the peninsula. So what did women in the, on the peninsula do regarding women's suffrage? Well, this club was incorporated in 1909 with 35 members. At the time, the peninsula was mostly a location of wealthy individuals with summer homes to leave the terrible San Francisco of summers, which I can attest to, speaking from you out here in the outer sunset of San Francisco. And these were women who organized notably outside of the influence of their husbands. This is something that was really reiterated in a lot of the research I was doing about this group, is that they were working largely independently of their husbands in terms of the activism that they were doing, so quite independent women. Catherine Cumberson and Eileen Finkler stand out as two of the most important women early on. Cumberson in particular, I found, had extensive correspondence with Jane Addams, famous for the settlement homes in Chicago, where she worked with immigrant women, and worked as the chairman of the Women's Peace Party of Northern California. So this is the work she did actually just after she left as president of the Women's Club. But you can imagine that the Women's Club of that time would have probably embraced a lot of these ideas. I don't want to make too irresponsible a leap here, but I think we can feel confident that if she was the president, they might have embraced some of these ideas, or she might have had a kinship with other women in the group who embraced this. Finkler, who was the second president of the group, was a part of the Federation of Women's Clubs. She was a member of the Red Cross, served on the Republican Party State Central Committee from 1916 to 1918, a time when the Republican Party was no longer alone. The Democratic Party had embraced women's suffrage, but the Republican Party would have been a really important place for women's suffrage. So I think we can feel pretty confident that Finkler would have been a suffragist. What are some of the things they worked on? Projects like installing a mission bell on El Camino Real, which sounds like a sort of general improvement project for the city, but that's part of what the good government movement was all about. And that might seem like a cute project today, but for them, this would have been, this would have been their expression of democracy, right? And citizenship. This is what organized womanhood was about. Okay. They also published a full issue of the Redwood City Democrat, which apparently was quite successful and was commended in the San Francisco Examiner. And they were able to fundraise to complete their clubhouse in 1911. So the timing couldn't have been better. This was only 9 days then after women's suffrage was passed in California. So what perfect birthdays for both, right? The clubhouse and women's suffrage in California. During World War II, during World War I, they helped the government to collect information about women's professional skills. The Hello Girls, I don't know that they had a direct connection with the Hello Girls, but AT&T had a switchboard in San Francisco. So one of the big contributions of women in the course of World War I was to operate these switchboards as what were known as Hello Girls. But I imagine that if they were collecting information in the women's club on the peninsula about the skills that certain women had, maybe some of this, folded into these better known projects. Again, I don't want to take too much liberty here, but it is important to sort of see, okay, it happens in a context that we can be certain about. Final words before I turn this back over to Carmen. I think it's important to understand that even in 1920, not all women in California or nationwide had the right to vote. So Native American don't get the right to vote until 1924. In 1825, Mexico gave Indigenous people the right to vote. So Mexican California, Indigenous people could vote. But once it comes under the jurisdiction of the United States, Native American people can no longer vote, not again until 1924. Puerto Rican women had to pass a literacy test. Those were not ended until 1935. And of course, the Voting Rights Act in 1965 was very important in making sure that states that had historically practiced racism or were currently practicing racist policies of voter suppression had their laws examined to make sure that people truly were enfranchised. Now, I think, unfortunately, 65 is maybe a historical relic now, understanding that a few years back, the Supreme Court really gutted a lot of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I think without touching on things that are too political, it would be fair to say that voter suppression is something that has been on the rise recently. So, all right. I guess my conclusion here is really that a lot of this is cyclical. A lot of this is work we still need to do. I think Jefferson was attributed to having said that the price for democracy is vigilance. And I think in some ways that feels like a heavy burden, but maybe it is one worthwhile to undertake.
Thank you so much. We are open for Q&A right now. If you have a question, I do encourage you to type it into the Q&A box. The first question is, in which elections could or could not California women vote between 1911 and 1920?
So, I mean, I guess if the question's on like a local level or like on a national level, I mean, women would have been able to vote for president in 1912 for president, which would have been significant. Hiram Johnson actually decides to run as Teddy Roosevelt's vice president in 1912. And so you have another run for governor. I think his term is shortened. But off the top of my head, I can't recall what the next governor's race is, but they would have been able to vote in that too. And, you know, I was sort of derelict in saying this, but women could already vote in various school board elections before that amendment. So that's something that they continue to do. I think we sometimes fetishize the right to vote nationwide. And while I do think it's very important to vote nationwide, I think that means we overlook the smaller ways in which women continued to vote in things, again, like these school board votes that were almost equally important to their communities.
Was it mainly the liquor lobby that made suffrage not as appealing to women or to families in, say, San Francisco versus farming communities?
Yeah. So a funny thing about 1911, women suffragists thought that, this doesn't directly answer your question, but I think it's an interesting anecdote. As women saw the returns from Alameda County, San Francisco County, the peninsula, they thought it was sunk. They really thought that it was over and they would have to rally and fight for suffrage all over again the next time. And it wasn't until the rural vote came in that rural communities and, of course, Southern California, namely Los Angeles County, really won the day for women's suffrage. The liquor lobby was incredibly instrumental. It was also important to remember that if you were a woman of privilege, and I'm thinking about privilege mostly actually in the context of wealth, because of course that's an important indicator on the peninsula, given that so many of these women were quite wealthy. While you had the time and ability to campaign for suffrage, and many of them did, you were insulated from some of the challenges of being a working class woman without the right to vote. So working class women in San Francisco and what working class women were on the peninsula were probably the more vocal constituent against the liquor lobby, and sometimes pit against other women because they didn't have the protection of money.
Next question. What is the difference between the terms suffragist and suffragette?
Yes, this is one that really, really bugs me. I'm so glad you asked that, because well-intended people who I think would identify maybe as feminists keep using the term suffragette when it was actually derogatory. So generally, if you go back to the historical record, women of this time who align with suffrage will call themselves suffragists. Suffragette is a diminution of suffragist and was meant to be insulting. It's like patting you on the head and saying, isn't that cute? You want the right to vote, girly. It's kind of offensive. I mean, I don't know, maybe I didn't get the memo. Maybe we reclaimed it and it's no longer offensive, but Susan B. Anthony would be offended if you use the term suffragette.
Was Kathleen Brown, who was the Democratic candidate for governor in 1994, the first woman of either major party to run for governor in our state?
That is a really good question. Yeah, because she was Jerry Brown's sister. So she's from the Brown dynasty, which has no bearing on whether or not she was the first. You know what? I'm going to jot that down. I won't be able to answer that to you right now, but I would like to know, and I don't know it, and I'm going to go find that out. I was considering that actually recently, just thinking about how California has not had a female governor. There is a Kate Brown isn't Oregon's governor Kate Brown? Not the same one, but yeah. So answer the question is I don't know, but I'm delighted you asked because I want to know, and I'm going to find out.
Next question is, in my view, the campaign against liquor was a stand-in for a campaign to combat violence to women and children. That was the red issue, drunken men beating up the family when they came back from their drinking bouts. And what is your take on that?
That's another good question, and one of those moments that as a historian I get to say, well, actually, right, part of that is true, and I think that is actually probably, if we were to say one thing about the Women's Christian Temperance Union, that was an important goal that they espouse, and they say that is their goal, and that's absolutely true. There was a huge problem with alcoholism across the United States, probably not as bad as the mid-19th century, but bad. It was pretty bad. However, one of the things that the temperance unions are also targeting are saloons. And saloons were a place for immigrant groups that were very important to their political organization. And so sometimes when you hear suffragists and you hear temperance leaders target and attack saloons, they very much are thinking sometimes theoretically and sometimes personally about domestic abuse. That's absolutely true, okay? But sometimes they're using it euphemistically to talk about exclusion and nativism. And one of the reasons why, once again, one of the reasons why California women are successful in 1911 and women nationwide are successful in 1920 is because they are aligning themselves with anti-immigrant groups that see women as important in breaking the liquor lobby, which is in line with the saloons, which they see as in line with the power of non-white or non-American born people. So yes, that is true. There's also these other sides of it. And I think it's important to hold both up as important, right? They're not mutually exclusive.
Okay, we are running short on time. We're almost at 2 o'clock. Did you have any final comments that you wanted to share with us?
No, I don't. It was a pleasure to join you all today. You know, this is an area of research close to my heart that I'm very interested in, and it's wonderful to be able to share some of this information with everybody. I miss our museums. I miss being in community with everybody. So I'm glad we can actually find space and time to do something like this.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate you taking the time. I know you've been quite busy trying to do online programming and classes at the College of San Mateo. Yes. So I really do appreciate you taking the time to be with us. For those of you listening, I do want to invite the rest of you to join us for our next webinar, which is Saturday, October 24th at 1 p.m. when Stanford archaeologist Laura Jones will discuss From Stone Age to High Tech, which will be about the history of Stanford's new campus in Redwood City. And then in November, our friends at Casa Circulo Cultural will be giving a special presentation for Day of the Dead. Thank you so much all for joining us, and I hope to see you again at the Courthouse Docket. Thank you.